Land is the first step to us building a physical campus here in Apple Valley. And we believe that having a permanent ministry space here in Apple Valley is going to help us reach our town in exciting new ways. We are trusting God to lead us. We're trusting Him to provide.
Did you know that every year over 10,000 people come through this building for graduations and teacher in-service days and community funerals? And we're able to provide that luxury to our town because of the faithful giving of our people. And it's our plan and our hope that this year we're able to pay off Powell Auditorium so that we can keep our hometown advantage right here in Victorville.
This plot of land is being used for ministry already. Every Tuesday we come out here and pray for the area. Adding infrastructure will help us reach our area in a much more impactful way.
God has been so good to us here at the Hesperia campus by blessing us with such an awesome building. But things have been a little tight lately. By adding more classroom space, not only do we get our kitchen back, but we get more space where we can teach kids, students, and adults alike how to reach their oikos more effectively right here in this community.
That's it. Welcome. And I just say welcome to your hometown. I want to say hey to our good friends out in Apple Valley, the AV, Phelan, the PH, and Hesperia, the HS. Those are the designations we utilize here in the office. And y'all here at the VV. Now, when I'm done with the presentation today, your lead, wherever you are sitting right now, your lead's going to pop up on the stage and close the service. I know some of you are in a hurry every weekend to get out of here, but just because we'll be walking off stage doesn't mean that it's just going to be a few more minutes. It won't take long, but we ask that you just remain seated for that close of the service. You might be in a little bigger hurry today because there's a big game coming up today. How many of you heard that there was a football game today? You did? Oh, okay. Yeah, I just caught it on the sly as well. I don't have a horse in this race, as they say, and so it was a little hard for me to get too excited. My Rams are not in the Super Bowl, unfortunately, and so I really sought the Lord on this. You know, who should I pick? And the Lord said what He always says when I ask Him a question: look into my word. So I did. Actually, I did. And found in the Bible, the word eagle or eagles surfaces 29 times. The word patriot or patriots shows up 0 times. So that's my pick. And I'll be rooting for the biblical team. I realize, however, we may actually have to reconsider the infallibility of Scripture later on this evening, but we'll see what happens. Okay, by the way, you know how many times the word Rams shows up in the Bible? 168, bro, right there. I hear a testimony. If those guys ever make it back to the Super Bowl, I don't think anybody's going to be able to beat them. I don't care what kind of offense they have. All right, well, I hope you have a good day, rest of the day. If you need a copy of the outline, raise your hand. We'll provide that for you. I didn't want to give it to you any sooner. I don't want you to take notes. Don't want you to, call Las Vegas and take Pastor Tom's word for this. By the way, just in case while we're handing out notes, if anybody is confused, I'm like kidding, okay? It's just fun. Just fun. It'd be nice, but it's just fun. All right, on the serious side of sports. One thing is clear to most everybody that looks into this subject, and that's that teams win more at home than they do on the road. Actually, it's a pretty interesting set of data on this. A lot of research has been done. Depending on the sport, at least in the professional ranks, anywhere from 54% of the time, the home team in baseball wins, that's the low end, to 69% of the time on the high end when it comes to soccer. Tobias Moskowitz and John Wertheim wrote a book entitled Scorecasting: The Hidden Influences Behind How Sports Are Played and Games Are Won. That's a long title, but that's their book. And they investigated this whole idea of a hometown advantage, and they determined that really there are only two factors that make the difference between playing a game at home and playing a game on the road. And those two factors are, number one, the rigors of travel, that is the difficult schedule, maybe back-to-back games in the NBA makes it more difficult. And secondly, the bias of referees, who as much as they try to be objective, and I'm not being critical of them, they tend to default to giving the home team the benefit of the doubt in critical game moments. Now here at HTC, our leadership team did not necessarily consider this information when we came up with our multi-site strategy. But there is certainly some crossover between what they discovered and what we have been discovering. And that is that this idea of localization and being able to go to church in your home community makes a difference in one's oikocentric mission. We are an oikocentric church. Some of you might be new. You don't know what an oikos is. Welcome as a first-time visitor. You don't know what an oikos is. It's a group of people, 8 to 15 of them, whom God has supernaturally and strategically put on the front burner of your life at any point in time in your life. And 95% of the people who give their hearts to Christ give their hearts to Christ because of the influence of someone in that group of 8 to 15 people. So we've been convinced for quite a while that the most fertile soil for the gospel tends to germinate closest to home. Now, we don't mandate that the site you must attend of our 4 is the one that's closest to where you live, but we've encouraged you to seriously consider that strategy simply as an outflow of our oikocentric church mission. We think the rigors of life, and we're all busy, going a million different directions. Well, so are the people in your group of 8 to 15. We believe that the rigors of all of our lives will pose less of a challenge the closer to home we worship. We believe that your local referees who are watching the way you play the game will give you more benefit of their doubts closer to home. In short, we believe there's a clear spiritual advantage for people who experience life and who worship in proximity to one another. And so we're beginning a campaign today because we're starting to get very serious about this multi-site strategy. I mean, we've been serious for a while, but now we're getting really serious. And we got 4 goals on this campaign. We're going to be presenting it to you for the next few weeks. We're going to be looking into the Word of God, the story of David and Goliath, and also resonating with these 4 goals, always reflecting on these 4 goals for the next few weeks. The 4 things that we want to accomplish in this Hometown Advantage campaign is, number 1, we want to purchase property for our Apple Valley site. Been meeting for, I think, 8 years now in a school. Props to you, Apple Valley. Can we hear them cheering over there? No, we can't. But open the window and we'll maybe hear them. They're excited about the prospect of being able to get brick and mortar over there. The property that we've identified, actually, this has been such a miraculous process that we're involved in. We've identified a number of parcels in Apple Valley over the last year, and the Lord has given us the opportunity, we believe, to now get this property. It's about halfway between Apple Valley Road on Yucca-Loma. Those of you who are familiar with the community, about halfway between Apple Valley Road and Navajo, so strategically positioned in the middle of that residential, mega district. And believe that that's just a wonderful place where God will provide for us. This property, by the way, is already in escrow. We hope that we'll close escrow over the next few months. We also, secondly, want to position portable buildings on the 14-acre Phelan property. Those portables will provide administrative space for our team over there. Let's hear it from Phelan. We also want to give them the opportunity to hold some meetings over the course of the week. For the time being, they will continue to worship at the Quail Valley Middle School. It's pretty cool. That rhymes. Just pick that up. Quail Valley Middle School's right there where they're meeting right now. Their property that we already purchased and paid for a few years ago is there, and we're going to drop some portables on that property. That's another goal of this campaign. We're going to add classroom space at our Hesperia site. As Pastor Jason mentioned, we're pretty packed over there. And in fact, they'd be cheering right now if they weren't struggling for air because they're so tight in Hesperia. And then we want to pay off the Powell Auditorium that you are sitting in here in the VV right now. It's been a great facility for us. It's where we generate our teaching for many of the weekends, not only for this site, but for other sites. And so we'll be able to finalize the note. All of that for $1.5 million. I know that's a chunk of change, but we believe that's what God is calling us to accomplish sometime between now and the end of August. I also want to mention, for those of you who have been contributing to the fund we call Next, the Next Fund was set up a couple of years ago to fund capital projects wherever they need to be engaged on whatever site, whatever the next step is for High Desert Church. Well, that, just for your information, that fund is now going to morph its name from Next to Hometown Advantage because we're going to be in this process for quite a while. Unpack your program for a minute. And you got a couple of cards in there. One identifies what the goals of the campaign are. You can read that in your own time. But this put me in, Coach. On the flip side, I'm in. Pull that out for a minute and just kind of walk through this response card that we're hoping everybody in our church will return to us over the next 3 weeks. One of the options, obviously, is to give. We want to raise $1.5 million. All of us here at HDC coming together to raise that amount. And if you would be willing to give something to that, just check that box. If the Lord leads you over the next few weeks to say, yeah, I want to be a part of this. You're not giving us what the amount is, just the fact that that's your heart. If you or when you do decide on an amount, then of course the envelope is there for you to use. But there are some other options. You're saying, I will pray where I live. And you don't pick one of these. You might pick them all. I'll deepen my commitment to Jesus. You're getting serious about your hometown advantage, representing Christ in your oikos. And you're thinking, maybe you've had conversations recently, and those people are asking questions, and you're saying, man, I got to get serious about my faith. And you're saying now, by checking that box, I want to grow closer to Christ with this hometown advantage. I want to invite my oikos to the site where I worship. I want to share my story. That's an interesting one because some of you might have a story about this localization concept, about actually worshiping where you live. And if you have a story, maybe the story involves someone that you invited to HDC, and because we had a site somewhere close in proximity to where they live, they decided to attend. Or maybe God has really blessed you. You used to attend the Victorville site like we all used to attend the Victorville site. And because you've moved your worship patterns closer to home, God has blessed you, and you've gained new energy and new perspective in your personal walk with Jesus. So that would be a story that we would be very, very happy to capture. And if you have one, we'd like to hear it. And we are one church, you guys. We're 4 different locations, but we're one church. I can't overemphasize that. This is not a campaign presenting 4 different goals to 4 different sites. Like every site's going to go after their little piece of the pie. We're all pulling together here. By the way, and we would not be able to see this over on the other campuses, and you can raise your hand here too, y'all, in Victorville. But at the other sites, I want you to raise your hand if you gave financially to make the Point Discovery Project here, our children's building here on the Victorville campus. If you raise your hand, if you participated in providing resources for that particular project. That's great. Put your hands down. And here in the VV, we thank you. We're excited that you were willing to sacrifice to make that a reality. That building is, man, that is a killer great building. And if you have kids here in Victorville, you know that because we're already able to utilize that. Well, I just want to tell you guys here in Victorville, because of the people who raised their hands on the other 3 sites, you're benefiting from their vision You're benefiting from their generosity. Your kids are going to grow closer to Jesus because those people care. And I want you all to know in Apple Valley and Hesperia and Phelan, when we engage these projects, Victorville has their back, amen? Because we are all one church and we're all gonna come together and we're gonna make all four of these goals a reality. And so that is our desire. All right, well, over the next few weeks, I also, as I mentioned, want to unpack one of the best-known stories in the Bible. How many of you have heard of the encounter between David and Goliath? Raise your hand, please. Real high, just for a minute. I just want to get okay, I think that's pretty close to 100%. You can put your hands down, unless you need to stretch. As we look through this story over the next few weekends, I hope we can get excited about the story again. You know, it's always a challenge for a pastor like me to elevate a story that is so familiar to so many people and to try to give it new life and new energy. But we're still gonna give it a shot. So it might be a lame attempt, but we're still gonna try. This story is going to give us three things to consider. Number one, and we're gonna look at today, is the idea of accepting a challenge. Next time, we're gonna look at the idea of fighting the battle. And then in a couple of weeks, the last of this series, we're gonna look at the idea of seizing the victory. Accepting the challenge, fighting the battle, and seizing the victory. All right, you ready? You got your little note sheets, you got your pens and paper and pencils handy. Fill in some blanks as we begin. I want you to know that doubts about your advantage can be discouraging, because y'all have them. And if you doubt it, that is discouraging. There is an inextricable link between doubt and discouragement, and you know this. Everybody in this room has doubted. You've doubted your faith. You've doubted your God. You even at times doubt High Desert Church, and that discourages you because you want to have confidence. All right, chapter 17, book of 1 Samuel in the OT. Look at verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war, assembled at Soko in Judah, pitched camp at Ephes Dammim between Soko and Azekah. You guys know where that is, right? Okay, we'll show you in a minute. Verse 2, Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah, where this all took place. And they drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines, on the other hand, occupied a different hill, while the Israelites were on another hill. And this valley, the valley of Elah, was between them. You know, the battle between the Jewish people and the Philistines is epic. And it went on for a long time. The Philistines originated on the island of Crete, out in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. The Philistines are considered one of the ancient sea peoples. And they made their way across the Mediterranean and established a beachhead on the shore of what would later become the nation of Israel. They were already on site there when the Jews arrived to Canaan after their exodus from Egypt. And you just knew from the very beginning, this was gonna be one of those mega conflicts for hundreds and hundreds of years. Different ideologies, different theologies, different civil codes of conduct. Two of the wars fought during the period of the Judges were with the Philistines. They were especially menacing because they were masters of metal fabrication. And therefore, they utilized state-of-the-art military weaponry that a lot of other nations didn't have access to. Early in the reign of Israel's first king, the reign of King Saul, with God's blessing, Saul enjoyed a series of military victories over a number of Canaanite people groups, including the Philistines. But at the time of David's encounter with Goliath, the Philistines had regrouped. And they were the number one threat to Israel's security. As they sought to expand their empire eastward, they started stepping on the toes of some of these settlements that the Jewish people had established in their long-awaited promised land. Now Israel is still without a capital city. They're still without a royal palace. They're still without a temple. but their home base was in the hill country east of the Philistines. And when it became clear to Saul that the Philistines' intentions were very clear, and that was to move their armies into those same hills where the Jews had settled, Saul decided to move east and confront them in the valley of Elah. There's a picture of God. Actually, King Saul took this picture and sent it to me. I'm just kidding. Take out the buildings, take out the road. And you see where Saul's camp is on this ridge. You see where the Philistines' camp was on the other ridge. Beautiful part of the nation of Israel. And there's a stream, this brook that runs in the valley between those two ridges. So now you can kind of visualize in your mind's eye what these armies are looking at. So the question I want to pose first and foremost is this: does either side have what you and I might consider to be a hometown advantage? Ironically, they could both claim to be the home team. The Philistines had been in this region for 200 years before the Jews even showed up. This is their land. And then the Jewish people believe that the land was a gift from God to them. So there they both stood, standing on two different ridge lines, just kind of staring at one another. At some point, one of them would have to initiate the battle. But you know what both sides had? Grave doubts that they could have a victory in that battle. Hence the standoff. And that standoff lasted a while. Now you'd think that if Saul had no doubts about his God being bigger than the gods of the Philistines, that he would initiate the battle and just get this thing over with. See, in a standoff like this one, sometimes a standoff like the one we encounter, where we don't know what to do. And we believe that something might be right, but we have doubts. You know, faith weighs in heavy. Believing that God has your back moves you forward. Allowing your doubts to linger over the long haul, see, those doubts don't just remain doubts. Those doubts kind of morph into fear. And fear keeps you right where you are, right now, immobilized, just kind of hovering in your spiritual walk. The problem is if you linger in that phase, from doubt to fear, kind of hang around in your fears, you not only don't move forward in your life, you begin to take steps backward. And we all know what that looks like. We could all testify about how our doubts led to fears, and our fears caused retreat in our spiritual life. You know what James said? James weighs in. He says, if you lack wisdom, if you're wondering what to do, if you're on the ridge line and you're not really sure how to move forward, you should ask God. Hi-ho, what a novel thought. And God will give you generously the wisdom you need, and he's not going to get mad at you because you're doubting. But when you ask, at some point, you got to get past your doubts. Because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, just kind of floating along, blown and tossed by the wind. That person who can't overcome their doubts should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. That word anything is a pretty comprehensive word. In the Greek, it means anything. You ask God for a lot of things, right? If you're like me, we got our lists. A lot of things on that list. Got to get over your doubts. Because if you doubt, you're double-minded, you're unstable. You're unstable. Do you doubt the reliability of God's promises? You know, we consistently elevate promises of God. We're in obviously a campaign, we're trying to raise finances. And we've talked for over 30 years to the HTC family about the promises of God and always giving back more than we give to him. For Saul, it was as good a question as it is for us. For Saul, the question was, did God promise the land of Israel or not? At some point, you got to make a decision about that, Saul. At some point, you're going to have to either go big or go home. Some of you perhaps have been considering moving forward in your faith about some in your immediate family. But you've been considering that for a long time now because you doubt. You doubt that it's going to work. Maybe it's a business decision. Maybe it's a conversation that you know is important to have with someone. But you just stand on the ridgeline and wait because you're not sure it's going to go well. Maybe it's trusting God with your kids. You just can't trust God with your kids. You're a controller. Just can't let go. Can't feel good about the fact that God's got them wrapped up in his eternal love. And you doubt. Some of you doubt if you can trust God with your marriage. You freak out all the time about your spouse. There's no peace in your relationship because you have doubts, and now maybe they've even settled into fears. Maybe it's taken the step you've considered for years, that's simply being baptized in water. We have opportunities regularly for you to stand up in front of not just the church family, but stand up in front of the oikos that you invite to come to that service. And by the way, they will come to that service. Something about baptism still has an aura in our culture. And when they show up, they're going to see you declare your faith in Christ. They're going to hear the gospel. I'm telling you, I'm promising you, that will be one of the greatest days in your spiritual journey. And some of you doubt that. I don't know. And you've been lingering in that doubt for how many years now? You know, the New Testament says water baptism is the first step you take after giving your heart to Jesus. For some of you, it might be the 4,000th step you take. And maybe that's why you've tripped over the first 3,999. We got baptism classes all the time. By the way, I believe there's one at all of our sites next weekend. You might want to check that out. Just got to get past your doubts, King Saul. You know why? Because if you slide into that next phase, look at this. The fear of failure is immobilizing. The fear of failure is simply immobilizing. See, we got both armies taking up their positions. The Philistines on the southern ridge, Saul's army on the northern ridge. Neither has the nerve to attack the other. And finally, the Philistines created a battle strategy that made them confident of a victory. And so it's the Philistines that took the initiative. Not God's people. The other guys took the initiative. They had more faith in a human being than Saul had in his God. Albeit he was a 10-foot human being, but anyway, that's still beside the point. In the ancient world, the strategy they chose to initiate this conflict was known as single combat. It's where one representative from each side would fight on behalf of the entire army, and that avoided unnecessary bloodshed. It was actually a strategy that was used often in the ancient world. In fact, in the Old Testament, we read about it happening several times, besides this encounter between David and Goliath. See, ancient armies could be broken down into three basic groups. You had the cavalry, soldiers on horses or in chariots. You had the infantry. Those were the foot soldiers. They carried swords and spears. And then you had projectile warriors. Those were the archers. Those were the slingers. Malcolm Gladwell describes the role of the slingers this way, and I'm quoting, he says, slingers had a leather pouch attached on two sides by a long strand of rope, and they'd put a rock or a lead ball in the pouch, and they'd swing it around in increasing wider and faster circles, and then release one end of the rope, hurling the rock forward. That was what a slinger would do, and they were highly skilled, highly trained. They were accurate up to 200 yards. Think about that for a minute. This Super Bowl Sunday, 2 football fields away, they were accurate. One historian said they were accurate within a hair's breadth. I've forgotten how wide that is actually, but for some of you who still can look at the person right in front of you and say, wow, that's pretty accurate. They killed birds in mid-flight with a slingshot. At close range, they were lethal. Anyway, Philistines send out who? They send out an infantryman. He's almost 10 feet tall. It's a big infantryman. And he calls on Israel to send out their best infantrymen. The challenge was that they would fight in hand-to-hand combat to the death, and the loser side would become the servants of the winner side. Look at verse 4. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits in a span, almost 10 feet. He had a bronze helmet on his head, wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. We'll get to that in a minute. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves, which were armored plates that covered a warrior's shins. He had a bronze javelin slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod. Its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him, so he wasn't alone. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Why are you even here? You guys are all chicken. Am I not a Philistine? Am I not your historic enemy? Do not I not stand in the path of peace for your people? Are you not the servants of Saul, the one who claims to serve the God of gods? Choose a man, choose an infantryman. Have him come down to meet me. Send your best infantry soldier down to fight me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we'll become your subjects. If I kill him, you'll become ours." And the Philistines said, "This day," watch this, "I defy you. Give me a man and let us fight each other, man to man." He declared his unbeatable status for so long, the Israelite army actually began to believe him, believe the fact that he couldn't be beaten. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Well, of course they were. Dude was 9 foot 9 inches tall. Now, we'll look at more specifics next time about Goliath's physical attributes. But just the optics, just standing on that ridge and looking at this individual must have been terrifying. His armor weighed, in our terminology, in our weights and measurements charts, his armor weighed 120 pounds. 120 pounds. His weaponry was bronze. Remember, the Philistines had a regional monopoly on military metal. His spear was the size of a weaver's rod, is what the text says. You know what that would make? The size of his spear? Make the size of his spear almost 12 feet long. Pastor Tom, 6 foot tall. Just double it, go ahead. Oh, wow. 12-foot long spear. Bronze tip weighed 15 pounds. Just the tip of the spear. It would have been capable of piercing any standard issue Israelite shield. The javelin that he had slung on his back is believed to be what the ancient world called a scimitar. It's one of those curved swords, maybe you've seen them in media, and they get wider toward the tip. The shield the attendant was carrying was more than likely a standing shield, probably taller. Goliath's shield was probably taller than any Israelite soldier. And these guys are looking over the ridge at this cat. Anyway, now we change scenes. Verse 12. David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons. In Saul's time, he was very old, so he got this old dude named Jesse. He's got 8 sons. 3 oldest boys had followed Saul to the war. They were in the military. They were on that ridge. The firstborn, Eliab, second, Abinadab, and the third, Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul. David stayed home. David went back and forth, though, as a messenger between Pops and the front lines in order to communicate with Jesse's 3 oldest sons. Look at this, verse 16. 40 days the Philistine came every morning and every evening. And what did the Israelite army do? They were immobilized in their fear. And Jesse said to his boy David, he said, "Take this ephah of roasted grain, these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers. Take it to the camp." In case you're wondering how much an ephah is, it's 1/10 of a homer. So you know, actually in our vernacular again, It's about 50 pounds of flour. Take along these 10 cheeses with the flour to the commander of the unit and see how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. And the assurance in the Hebrew, it's interesting. It's not just, hey, yeah, tell Dad we're doing great. It was physical evidence, perhaps even the spoils of the battle, that the army was victorious, at least to some degree. Little did Jesse know the army wasn't doing nothing. 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 Anyway, there was Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah. They're fighting against the Philistines. So David shows up, leaves the flock of the care, his flock at home in the care of a shepherd. And he got all the stuff his dad gave him, and he set out. And he reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. This is what I love. They're not doing anything except cheering. It's easy to cheer. It's easy to clap. And it's easy to do nothing while you clap. I don't even know why they're shouting a war cry, because there's no war. Israel and the Philistines are drawing up their lines facing each other. They'd all draw their lines. They wouldn't do anything. And David left his things with the keeper of supplies. He ran to the battle lines. Wanted to see what the battle was looking like. See, he's a kid. He's a young man. And man, kids love battles, especially boys. As he was talking with his brothers, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his line, shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw Goliath, they all ran. Not us. No way. Insecurity leads to immobilization. Immobilization eventually leads to intoxication. And I didn't just pick that word because it started with an I. I picked that word because it's important. Intoxication. See, it's one thing to be immobilized yet want to get going. It's quite another to be intoxicated with fear to the point that you're satisfied to do nothing. And that satisfies you. Fill in a couple more blanks. See where this is going? The status quo is intoxicating. Status quo is intoxicating. Verse 25, this is where the story really begins to pick up speed. I love this. So the Israelites have been saying, do you see how this guy keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. Just like Christians, can you see how bad the world has become? Isn't it a shame? Isn't it a shame how much sin there is in the world? And so little righteousness to confront it. Even when the king will give great wealth to the man who kills Goliath, he will also give him his daughter in marriage, will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. You know what that is? That is a great package. I mean, you get a lot of money. Check this out, you're going to be rich. You're going to have a celebrity wife. You're going to marry a princess. You know what that meant? You're going to be a celebrity yourself. See, when you marry the princess, you have a clear path to the throne, to perhaps become the king of Israel. That's how bad this got. I mean, the list just got longer, and now you got tax exemption for yourself and your family. You'd all sign up for that one. Even with God on their side and the promise of that level of reward, Saul could not talk anyone into taking up the challenge. They all just sat there. You know you'll be rewarded. You know God always returns exponentially more than we sacrifice. You know that, right? Crickets. All across the ridgeline. Crickets. Every one of those soldiers knew that eventually someone was going to start a fight. And that meant somebody was going to die. This thing wasn't going away. It wasn't like Goliath was going to defy the God of Israel for another 40 days. At some point, There's going to be the shot, the first shot, and it's on. See, intoxicated means that you lose control of your faculties, right? That's why I chose the word. As opposed to the logikos. Remember a couple of weekends ago we talked about the will of God in Romans 12 and how logical the will of God is? You can't think logically when you're stoned out of your gourd by alcohol. You can't think logically when you're stoned out of your mind with drugs. You can't think logically when you're stoned out of your mind with the status quo. See, lots of people do the same thing that we see depicted in the story. Their doubts haunt them, their fear grips them, and over time they get into the rut of the status quo. And it becomes a habit to not respond when God calls you. Some of y'all got a bad habit, man. That's all this is. Problem for you is it doesn't take long for a rut to turn into a grave. Over time, that's what happens. You know, research reveals that both kids and adults, this is true for every age group, they'll choose something familiar, even though it's worse, over something admittedly better, but unfamiliar. Now, I've shared this with you in the past, but it just blows my mind. The Israelites were thinking, the way they were thinking on the ridgeline that over those 40 days, they've been thinking that way for a while. Long before even David was born, they simply couldn't get their minds around a promised land of freedom and prosperity. Remember when they're in the wilderness, you know, before they got to Israel? So they're in the wilderness and things started to get a little difficult. And what did they tell Moses? Let's go where? Let's go back to Egypt. Why? Because at least we know what that's like. They weren't saying, hey, let's speed this thing up and get to the promised land as soon as possible. Believing that God would be waiting for them there. They were more like, wouldn't it be better if we just went back? Going back is what they were used to. You know, have you ever wondered, and this may be, let me give you the metric first. The Exodus, 20% of the Bible is the story of the Exodus. A full 1/5 of the Word of God, if you added up both Testaments, is the story of the Exodus. You know why that's true? You know why there is so much about the Exodus in the Bible? Because it's our story. When all the dust settled, the wilderness experience had lasted over 33 times longer than scheduled. It took God's people, once they got to Kadesh Barnea, it took them 40 years to make an 11-mile trip. And now it's taking them 40 days to fight a 30-second battle. And it's easy to criticize them for their lack of faith, but maybe Paul's warning to the Romans is intended for us today. Romans chapter 12, verse 3. You pass judgment on them, and yet you do what? Same things. We hold on tightly to what we're familiar with. You know what many of you are familiar with? Just standing on a ridge, looking at the obstacle, saying there's no way we can win this battle. We hunker down in those ruts that we're in. And it's not because we love the rut we're in. It's not because we love life in a foxhole. It's because the status quo can be intoxicating. And then the Lord pulls us over for living erratically. Woo, 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 woo. And we claim, what, officer? I haven't been drinking. DUI, decisions under the influence. Never work out. Never work out. Politicians become poll-driven. They allow the fears of the community to determine the way they govern instead of offering leadership. Pastors, it's true even in my vocation, they play it safe. They don't want to trust God for a better, bigger future for their church. It's too risky. They don't want to jeopardize their jobs. They're too close to retirement. And people who attend those churches want to play it safe. They hesitate, they doubt, they fear, not sure they want to venture into a new worship site because they have so many wonderful memories at the old worship site. You know what life's greatest addiction is? We could talk about substance abuse all day. Life's greatest addiction is an addiction that affects all of us, and it's to our comfort zone. And David thinks the whole Israelite army, including his brothers, need to go to rehab. He couldn't believe that the Israelite army would just stand there and allow their doubts and their fears to perpetuate the status quo. It was unconscionable to David that a pagan, even a 10-foot tall pagan, would be allowed to stand out there and continue day after day and defame the God that they all claimed they served. And finally, he had had enough. Some of you will return that put me in coach card over the next few weeks indicating that you want to give money to this campaign. Truth is, you've wanted to give for years. I don't know if you've sat through 40 campaigns, but if the metric fits the situation, maybe there have been. But you never seem to be able to find a way to move off the ridge, to rush the valley, initiate the battle. And you're never going to find out if God is faithful to you until you decide you're going to engage the fight. This campaign is going to give you that chance. You're going to test God by faith. You know what David said? He said, put me in, coach. And Saul, he didn't have a better alternative. And Goliath, he challenged Israel to send down an infantryman. Unfortunately for him, he didn't get one. He got a slinger. Well, I'm going to hand this off. We're going to pick it up next time. Story is just heating up, folks. It's going to be fun. But I got a lead pastor on all four sides going to come out and tell you how wonderful you are.